Hello, I'm Julie Hay, and I'm going to talk to you about research. My background for doing this is actually that I am the editor of the International Transactional Analysis Research Journal. When we get to the end of this, I'm assuming that you'll be given copies of the PowerPoint, and the reference to that, the website, is at the end. It's free access to everyone. There is also another website, taresearch.org, also listed, and we do there show the abstracts in Spanish, not in Portuguese, although if anyone would like to volunteer to do that, I would be delighted to hear from them. So as a result of that, I've had quite a lot of involvement in research, hence me talking to you about this as a topic. So let's begin with thinking, why bother anyway? You know, a lot of people, when they hear the word research, they go, oh no, boring, I don't understand, or whatever. The reasons why. Lots of TA refers back to Spitz. Byrne referred to Spitz in terms of what he found when he was looking at what happened to children in orphanages. And all of our stroking theory has been based on what Spitz apparently found. When you look back at his research, it actually wasn't done very well at all, and it got misinterpreted as well. So the reason we should pay attention is when we start telling everybody that this research says this, we need to have made sure that it really did say that, and that it was conducted in a competent manner, and there was a lot wrong with the way that Spitz did the research. Now, not so terrible when he was doing it. It was a long time ago, but when we look at what we understand now, then we realize it's not that reliable. Another thing is that much more recently, but still a long time ago, someone called Gail did some interviews with people to research how useful their therapy had been. And this is quite amusing. What he found was that the people he interviewed then said that the interviews had been more useful to them than the therapy had been. When we look at that, we can see that that was probably because he invited them to talk about themselves and what had happened and the process of the therapy. So in a way, that was having a therapeutic impact, and inviting them to step outside and think about and reflect on. But it's quite fun to think that, you know, you do some research to look at whether what you're doing is any good, and you discover the research is more useful. Another reason is because non-TA approaches have done a lot more research, or published a lot more research, than the TA approaches had done, which means that they've got more recognition. We need to publish research, and therefore we need to do research so we can publish it to get a high level of recognition. And the other thing is, I couldn't resist adding this. The reason we need to bother with all this is because the very first paper that was sent to the New Research Journal came from Jane Costa in Brazil, and I was determined that we would publish it. It took a while because of translation and so on. At that point, she didn't speak any English. She does now. I didn't speak any Portuguese, and I don't now either. But with the help of things like Google and so on, we managed it. So there's something as well about, let's share what we're doing around the world. Now, what TA research has been done, this is by way of tackling this myth that there isn't any. We set up the International Journal in 2010 In the very first issue, we had something that was called the Big List. Thomas Olson had surveyed all the research studies he could find between 1963 and 2010 when we published. And he'd done this great long list of what had been there, showing, in a lot of cases, briefly what it was about. And he also was selective, so he only included things that he thought had been done well enough. Since then, in the journal, which I tend to refer to as IJTAR by taking the initial letters in English, we've had the Big List, which was a paper in its own right, and then we've had another 44 papers. I am now preparing next January's issue, so there'll be a few more then. 22 of those were research about psychotherapy and 22 were not. They were the other fields. Out of those other fields, 19 were about what I call developmental TA, which is organizational, educational, coaching, counseling, and so on, the non-psychotherapy applications. 5 were about how TA training works, and 2 were actually about research methodology. When we look at what's important, then always ethics. So if you're thinking of doing some research, you need to pay a lot of attention to the ethical considerations. Doesn't mean there have to be ethics issues. You have to make sure there aren't, basically. That would normally mean you need some supervision of the research so that someone else is looking at what you're doing as well, helping sure that you're not overlooking or discounting something. You need to pay attention to the contracting, particularly because the research tends to be alongside us doing our professional work. So we need a contract that says, I am helping you in some way and I'm also researching. And I quote the British Psychological Society about the ethical things are respect for the dignity and autonomy of the people being researched. The research must have scientific value. So we don't just do it because it's interesting to do. There should be some scientific value. We need to think about our social responsibility. That might mean being careful what we choose to research because it might seem like it's discriminatory or something. And we need to maximize the benefit and minimize any harm from any research that we're doing. So when we come on to the more practical things about ethical considerations, if you're planning to do any, you need informed consent from all the subjects, the people that you're researching. That means they must actually understand what's involved. There must be informed consent, not just, yes, I don't understand what you mean, but yes, you can do it. There mustn't be any negative consequences if they refuse. So it has to be that you'll still do the work with them. You won't sort of leave them out because they've refused to take part in the research. They must also have the right to withdraw. Normally that's at any time until you've finalized your research paper or so on. Sometimes it might be any time before publication, but that's a bit risky. It's much better to say they can withdraw any time up to you've finished doing the work with them. It may be necessary that you then show them it. That will depend on what you agree. That's not always going to be necessary because you will have anonymized the clients anyway. It mustn't interfere with the service that you're giving the client. So as a practitioner, you must still be giving them the best service possible. Now that could mean that sometimes you have to just stop doing the research because for some reason it's going to interfere with doing what's best for the client. There mustn't be any negative outcomes. I'm thinking there of, as an example, doing some research about what the employees feel about their management, and then publishing it, and the management will get really cross with the employees, even though they don't know who said what. So we have to think ahead about, okay, when I get to the end of this, what will it show, and could that actually backfire on the people who've been involved? Confidentiality and anonymity, fairly obviously, it always needs to be set up and have some specific parts that actually show how will confidentiality be maintained. Typically by anonymity, by you don't give anybody names, but you also need to be very clear, well, who gets to see all this data? Where is it kept? Who might have access to it? Who might get access to it after you've finished, for example? And then it should not be just to get a qualification. So we should not be starting research studies because we're doing some training and we want to get a qualification and it requires us to do some research. There has to be something more to it than that. That's like thinking back to what I said about scientific value. It has to be something that's going to be useful to the profession afterwards, and not just because you thought you were curious. Now, research methodologies. The basic breakdown is quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative is about counting, basically, in numbers. So that tends to be experiments, surveys, statistical analysis type things. As an example of that, Susanna Temple, some of you may have come across this, she introduced the Temple Index of Functional Fluency. It was a particular way of looking at ego states and how they showed up, but it was quantitative because basically she took some existing theories, then came up with a model of ego states, and then asked people to allocate various behaviors under the headings that she'd already got, and then just collected up a lot of those. So it was a statistical analysis of, you know, how many people put this under that heading. Qualitative, on the other hand, is based on the idea that objective reality doesn't actually exist. So it's always about how people are looking at, how they're constructing their world. So that includes things like ethnographies. So actually looking at what's going on within cultures and so on. Grounded theory, which means you investigate something and some theory emerges from that, from the ground upwards, as it were. Case studies, which is often the sort of thing that we would do in TA anyway, because we do tend to do an intervention and that lends itself very easily to case study research. And phenomenological studies, and that tends to be where we start to find out what people are feeling and experiencing in something that's happening. And then often that might be pulled together to present some themes that have come out of it. So they're sort of broadly looking at some of the ways that research gets undertaken. We also need to think about our paradigms, our maps of the world about research. 3 of these possible to take into account. If we have an ontological paradigm, it means that we're thinking about how do we approach the nature of reality. So like I already mentioned for qualitative, it's like there is no objective reality, there's only subjective. Whereas for a quantitative, if we're going to count things, we have to be assuming that there is something objective. So if we're trying to measure something, we have to have a paradigm that says everybody will know what that is, so we can then measure and count it. The epistemological paradigm is about what are our sources of knowledge. So are we using intuition or are we using logic when we do our research? And also, are we looking at it as empirical, based on what's actually happening, or authoritative, based on what people have said is happening, like the experts in the area? What have they authoritatively said is our knowledge? Or are we just looking at what knowledge people have got, and can we pull out what that is? And then finally, the axiological. That's where we pay a lot of attention in the research to the ways that our values and our value judgments will impact on our practice and how we do our research. Now, when you read up research studies, you realize that people come from different paradigms. So it's quite useful to think about what these are, and then where would yours be if you did some research? Because all of these will have their advantages and their disadvantages. Now, moving on a bit then, there are different ways of, different things we focus on when people do research. And some common words that get used when people are researching. So effectiveness is, does it work? So you're looking at what somebody's doing and saying, does it work? Whereas efficacy means, does it match the need? They're quite different. You could do wonderful research and say, yes, you know, this approach to addiction really stops people being addicted, but it might be that you're using it for people who aren't addicts, so it's not matching the need. So we have to look at, are we measuring the efficacy? How well does it match the client needs? Or are we actually researching how it actually works, and does it do it the way it says it does? Next is manualization, having protocols for how we behave, as I see how the word gets translated. We have to do that if we want to standardize, so that we can compare one item of research with another. We have a series of case studies running in the journal, and it's really important that the people doing them, if we want to add them together, as it were, and say, look, we've now had 5 people find the same thing with individual clients, we need to know that they were actually doing the same thing. What tends to happen is it gets written down as a manual. In the UK, we have lots of research into cognitive behavioural therapy. And the argument there is that they're all doing the same because there's a manual that says this is how you do cognitive behavioural therapy. Now, one of the problems with that is that beginners work to manuals, experienced practitioners don't. What they tend to do then is be much more flexible about the needs of the client. So the problem then is, if you base the research results on the idea that everyone's doing the same thing, you need to make sure that everyone is doing the same thing, and you haven't got a bunch of experienced practitioners who are being much more flexible and not just following a manual. And it's one of the difficulties sometimes with transactional analysis, I notice as well, that there's so many options we've got there. It's not that easy to come up with a manual that says just do this for every client and it will work. And then the other thing is common factors. I'll say some more about that in a minute, but basically part of the thing about our focus on research is, are we actually investigating something that we all do anyway? So are we trying to prove that our approach is better than another approach? when in fact, when you look at what we do, it isn't any different. So that's another thing that people have to think about if they're going to start doing some research. What is it that you're going to look at, and is it distinctive enough to be able to make a case that, in our case, does it relate to TA, transactional analysis, and not to other similar ways of working? Now, some research methods, action research and communities of practice. They tend to be when people are doing research and they're part of the dynamic of what's going on. So they're in a community and they're looking at that. Action research tends to be, I'm doing some actions and I'm going to research them. Somewhat different to that would be what they refer to as praxis. This is a bit of a strange one because it is about your practice, but it's something different. I usually think of it as its reflection and co-creativity. It's actually looking at reflecting back on what you're doing, but you would reflect while you're doing it. So in action, you're reflecting. You would reflect afterwards, so that's reflecting on the action. But you would also then reflect in supervision of that action. And that all comes together to show that you've got some reflection, but you've also got co-creativity with the client and also with the supervisor. Then there are approaches that are called discourse analysis, or sometimes referred to as conversation analysis. That tends to be where people make recordings, they produce great transcripts of what gets said, and then there are different ways you can go through and analyze what's there. You might look for, who mentions the same things. You might use TA to analyze, like what were the drivers, what were the strokes, what were the ego states, and so on. So it's just another method of saying, okay, we'll capture conversations or discourses and we'll analyze them. Interpretive phenomenology, in English that's not easy. Interpretive phenomenological analysis is where we're then looking at people's experiences. So you might do interviews with people about their reactions to something. And then you might also do something like a discourse analysis in that you look at the transcripts. But basically then you are looking to find what themes there are in terms of how they're responding, what their phenomenological experience has been to what's going on. I'm noticing on this slide that there's something that's not there, which is called repertory grid. That's a particular way of doing some research where you invite people to think about how they view or their perceptions of different things that are happening. That might be you take a group and you ask them to think of different managers, and then you compare them, like what does these ones do that those don't, and these do that those don't, and so on. It's another specific form of research that can be quite useful. If you think that sounds interesting, for any of these you might want to follow up and figure out what you might do about it. One I do want to talk about a bit more, particularly because we've done a lot of publications in the journal about it, and also, as you'll see, Mark Widowson provided a complete issue of the journal, issue number 3, volume 3, issue 1, talking about how do you do a hermeneutic single case efficacy design study. Basically, this is how that works, and this is something that anybody could do because we're always doing case studies. Everything we do with the client is a potentially a case study. You start by keeping careful records and recordings. You get feedback from the client, and then they're interviewed afterwards as well to talk about how it was. What you then do is you get one group of people together, and they make what is called the affirmative case. They look at all this evidence, what's been said, what was the feedback, what might the results be as well of any questionnaires that have been used to measure progress. And they make a case for saying that this practice, this therapy or whatever it is, actually worked, the client got better, and here's our case for why. You then take a second group and they make the case to say, no, it didn't, and this is our reasons, this is the evidence we see why we don't think it did work. The group who've done the affirmative case can then challenge the skeptic case. So it's like one group says, yes, it worked, look at all this evidence of why it worked. Another group says, no, you're wrong, it didn't work because of all of this. And then the first group say, no, you're wrong, it did work. What then happens is you have some people who are called judges, who are another group, and they review all of that. They look at the affirmative, they look at the skeptic case, they look at the challenge to it, and they then say, on the balance, it looks to us like, yes, it worked, or no, it didn't work. And they actually give it a rating about, yes, it definitely worked, or maybe it worked, or definitely didn't work, or probably didn't work, or we can't make up our minds. It's a really interesting way of looking at it, and it's something which any of us could actually repeat. So let me just talk you through how that would happen. How would you plan to do one of these hermeneutic single case efficacy design studies? You can see why we abbreviate it. Which participant or client or clients would you do it with? Which practice would it be about? So how standardized is that? Who would you use for your analysis teams? So who do you know that could make the affirmative case and the skeptic case? That could be other TA people. It could be students. Who would you have as the judges? And then they do need to be a bit more independent. Quite often, in the cases I've seen, they may not even be TA people, because all they need to do is read what the cases say. What are the outcome measures you might use? Because you do need some way of finding out whether the client has changed in some way. Quite often we'll use other forms of questionnaires that have been validated separately through research. What are the mediator factors? What that means is, what else is going on that might have made a difference to your client so that the way they changed wasn't really down to you? On an individual basis, that might be in the middle of their therapy, they suddenly meet a new person and start a wonderful relationship, and that's what made them feel better, not your wonderful therapy. In an organizational setting, it's really difficult because when an organization brings in a consultant for a change program, that means they're already changing the culture of the organization. So it's really hard to work out, was it your fantastic consulting and team building and so on that made the difference? Or was it because the management were now acting differently towards people? Or even was it because people got so scared that the company was going out of business that they finally started to work harder, for example? So that's the mediator. What other variables are there? And then what limitations are there as well in terms of how far can you extend what you've done to say, well, if this worked here, it will work everywhere. Increasingly in the journal now, we are saying in the titles where the work was done and with whom. So we do tend to say, you know, this was done with a white woman, Italian or British or something. Even in quantitative research, you need to look and think, well, okay, they did this with, you know, 100 students, but those students were all in the Philippines, for example. So it might mean that students everywhere do the same thing, but it might not. And it might mean that only students do it and people who are not students don't do it. So that's limitations. Plus, one of the limitations is always going to be, if I'm the researcher and I'm the therapist, then, or the practitioner, there's always going to be some potential bias about how well I can look at what's happening and going on. Now, how might research go wrong? And you'll see that I've got more than one PowerPoint on this. Spurious causality means we think something caused something, but it didn't. It was a coincidence, or even it's back to front. I can remember some years ago seeing a TV program about global warming, and the argument was it the sun and the activity of the sun that was causing the global warming, or was it just a coincidence that that was happening? So somebody was saying, look, every time there's increased sunspot activity, I think it was something like a year later, the temperature here goes up. But it's very difficult to prove that one actually caused the other. Extraneous variables, that's more about what other things are getting changed that might have led to the differences. Sometimes the wrong variable is being researched. So people have chosen something to research, but it isn't actually the variable that they need to be looking at. There may be a poor choice of participants. Sometimes that may be because it's difficult to get people involved. They don't want to take part in the research. And it may just be that somebody hasn't thought through enough about who the participants need to be. There might be a biased choice of participants. So it might be that we've chosen the more friendly of our clients or something without even realizing that's what we're doing. And there might be a poor choice of topic. So the whole idea might not be a really useful thing for us to be researching. Now, the next slide, what else might go wrong? I'm hoping this doesn't put you off. The idea of this is that to encourage you to do some research, but to avoid the obvious pitfalls. Hawthorne effect, discovered by Roethlisberger and Dixon back in 1939. Hawthorne was the name of a factory. And what happened was some researchers went in to look at productivity. And what they found was they gave the group of people better lighting and the productivity went up in this factory. So great, you know, give them better conditions. So they changed other things and they found that productivity went up. And then they gave them worse lighting. I'm not quite sure who was clever enough to think of doing this, but they gave them worse lighting and the productivity went up. And they made other conditions worse and the productivity went up. What they realized eventually was the reason the productivity went up, we can explain quite easily in TA, but of course that wasn't around in 1939. It was the effect of the researchers showing an interest in the people they were researching. So the people felt more important. So because the researchers kept coming and looking at them and talking with them, they worked harder. Now we would know that they were getting extra strokes. They were getting extra human attention, and that was having a positive effect. So that is now known as the Hawthorne effect. We've seen that also with experiments where they use animals, for example, where if they are doing experiments, they have to be really careful, because if the assistants who look after the animals start making a fuss of them and stroking them or something, that also throws the results. The same process. It's like the Hawthorne effect. Some kind of human attention, stroking, will interfere with the results. Then there's the nicely named dodo bird effect, Rosenberg, 1936. These things have been known about for a long time. This is a bit like when I talked earlier about the common factors. It's this idea that we all do much the same things. So when we argue about different approaches being more effective, they're actually all the same. This is named from the book called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and it's because the animals had had a race, and they said to the dodo bird, who won? And the dodo bird just said, well, everybody won, and they should all have prizes. So the idea behind this is that all the therapies, for example, all work. They should all come out as showing that they're effective. And part of that will be because of the common factors. A lot of what we're doing is the same. And that would apply also to coaching, counseling, consulting, and so on. There's only so many different things we can actually be doing in human interactions. So we might give them different theoretical labels, but they're not necessarily that different. And then there is what they call application assumption error. That's where we muddle up the fact that the research conditions are not quite the same as the real world, as it were. Because we're doing the research, it changes things. Quite often that would come up because research is done in a special place as well. So that would be an obvious one, that if you bring people into a particular environment to do the research, they may not perform in the same way when you put them back out there in the real world. But even if you think, well, but I'm working with clients in the same way I work with clients, there's still the fact that once you take on the researcher identity, and they know that, you've actually changed the context. So you've then got this issue of how can you factor out that change things in a maybe a subtle way, but it might mean that when someone does what appears to be the same as you, but without the research piece added in, it's not going to work in the same way. So those are some ideas about how it might go wrong, not intended to put you off, just intended to help you think about how could you avoid them. Stages of research. Again, there's a couple of PowerPoints on this. If you want to do some, first thing, start a journal. Make loads of notes of everything, because you will need it to look back. You won't be able to remember everything. You need to start writing it all down in a big journal. Then think about your aims. Who will it help? How do you think it might help them? So this is how you're making sure that this is a worthwhile thing to do, that it does make a contribution. Next thing is research the literature already. It's so much a shame when I see somebody present something and they haven't actually bothered to read around it first, and someone's already done what they've just done, or someone has done something that then means that they've overlooked some aspect which they could easily have picked up on. So you need to read the relevant literature. You need to actually research it. I mean, it won't just present itself to you. And then you do an initial research plan, but you need to have read around it, the topic first. And then your initial plan is, what are you going to do, with whom and how? before you proceed, then step 5 is check that that would be compatible with your service to your client. If this would get in the way of you providing your professional service to the client, then you can't do the research. So you have to check that I can run this alongside and it won't have a negative effect. After that, then you would go for ethical approval. Different ways this gets done. If somebody's doing, for example, a university qualification, there's usually an ethics committee who look at what they're going to do. It might be that you just get some professional colleagues to have a look at it for you. It might be if you're part of a training institute or something, they have a group of people. But what we do need to do is make sure that somebody else who can be expected to understand this is checking that what we're going to do will be ethical. We don't just decide it for ourselves because we might be overlooking something. Having got the ethical approval, now we're ready to contract. And we need to contract with all the stakeholders. If it's just you and a client, okay, but if you're working in a center, they need to agree. If you're working within an organization or a school, they need to agree. If you're working with employees, the organization needs to agree. If you're working with children, the school might need to, the parents might need to. So you do need to think about who are all the people who are impacted by this, who have some involvement, and you need to protect your right to publish, and you need to protect their right to withdraw. So that should all be in the contract, plus confidentiality spelled out, like I'm going to lock it all away and I'm the only one who can see it, or this person will be typing the transcripts and they're, trusted as a confidential secretary or whatever. So you get it all spelled out. Then you do the research, and as you're doing it, you get some supervision to help you take a meta perspective and see if you're needing to change anything. And then finally, you collate the results and you write the report. So those are the stages if you want to undertake some research. When it comes to writing papers, some ideas about that. A longer title is better. This has come in more recently. A longer title is better because then people, when they're looking for something, they get more idea from a longer title. But it's also useful because of Google searches and so on. The longer the title, the more people are going to pick up on things when they're searching. But there's also been some research done on finding that people who write research articles with longer titles get referenced more often than people with shorter titles. Really interesting, but it may be because they could find it more easily. They didn't actually research why, but they just showed, I think it was more of a statistical analysis, they could show that the longer titles got more references in other people's work than shorter titles. So pick a title that really describes what you're doing. The abstract should summarize, and I put a smiley face here because for me, the abstract should mean you don't need to read the paper. So when you read the abstract, it should be, okay, I get what they did, what happened, what the results were, what the limitations were. Obviously, you hope it will prompt people to read the paper, but the abstract should summarize it for someone. Keywords are normally included in academic articles, and they are being done for searching purposes. So there are systems where they would just look at the keywords. It seems to me increasingly that that becomes less significant in the days of Google and so on, because certainly if you do open access type of publishing, people can find any of the words in it, but it is still customary to pull out some of the key words that you would expect people to search for. Then a literature review should come next. What came before you did this? Then, what was the objective of your study, or what were your hypotheses? So what were you setting out to find out about? If you're actually saying, I want to prove that this causes that, you have to have the opposite. You have to set it up so that you're also trying to prove that it doesn't cause that, because otherwise it's hopelessly biased. But you could also have, it's a question you want to explore. It doesn't have to be, I want to prove something. It's just, I want to find out how effective what I've done has been. If you have any funding sources, it would normally be that you would mention those as well at this point, because they're sources of potential bias, of course. You've probably seen how people have protested that years ago, a lot of research was funded by tobacco companies who mysteriously found out that smoking didn't cause you a problem. And now people will do research funded by the sugar industry and say sugar's good for you. So we need to mention the sources. Usually in TA, there isn't going to be that much of a problem, because the funding sources will tend to be some institute or some foundation where they just want to help you do genuine research, and they're not trying to push you in a particular direction. Continuing on that, then after the funding sources, you need the ethical considerations, and I've put there always. Yeah, when I get papers for IJTA, I just send them back if they haven't actually thought about ethical considerations and satisfied that there were none, or that they took care of them. Then the methodology, the methods you've used, the philosophy that you've worked to, details of your sample. So who were you researching? That might be things like how old were they, gender, race, all sorts of things like that. Any details that might matter about the people that were the subjects of the research. Then the results. Now the results should come through neutrally. So it should just be, okay, this is what we found, not isn't that wonderful or something. That waits for the discussion. So you just present the results that people can interpret themselves, and then you discuss what does it mean. And that's where you can then put in your thinking and what do you think it means and so on, which people can read and agree or disagree with. Then the limitations, and again you'll see I've put always. There should always be something about limitations, even if it's only that you were the researcher and the practitioner, if that's the case. But it might be that it's only a small sample, or it's a very distinct sample, or you realize as you were doing it that you missed something. With hindsight, you would have done something differently, or that can go in the limitations. And then finally, the references. And we need to pay attention to the conventions about copyright as well. So, you know, we can quote certain pieces out of books as long as they're not too long and we reference it. If we want to reproduce the diagrams, we normally need permission unless we're adapting them in some way. So that's how to think about it if you want to do a research paper. I'm sorry that the way we're doing this means I can't actually answer questions and I can't be there afterwards for you to chat to. I will be in Brazil next year if any of you are there. I'm also quite happy to be contacted. I'm sorry it has to be in English. Here are the references of what I've talked about. And you can see at the top is Jane Costa's article that appeared in the journal and has a nice long title. And says what it was. So anyone looking at that thinks, oh yeah, I'm really interested, I want to read it. Or they can think, no, that's not what I'm looking at. And I'm assuming that you'll get the PowerPoints anyway. So there are ways of contacting me if you want to. There's also the website for the journal, free to everyone. And then there's another website, TA Research, where we put the abstracts, as I said, in Spanish. I'm happy if someone wanted to volunteer to give me another language, that would be great. And I think hopefully someone might collect up your questions and let me know them afterwards and I can respond. I'm always very happy to help people. As the editor, I don't do what Bern did. He wrote, if you're going to send stuff for publication, don't send me the first draft. I go the other way. I say, no, I'm really happy if you just send me your first draft, your ideas. I would much rather talk to you then about what you might still need to include, so that you then do something that runs well as a piece of research and we can publish it. It's such a shame when somebody sends me something after they've done it and then I have to say, but didn't you think about this? So I'm always really happy to help, and I look forward to hearing about any questions or comments you've got, and to seeing some of you in Brazil next year. Bye.